The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hi friends, thank you for joining me for this brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. And today, this podcast is certainly going to be living up to its name. I'm going to be talking all about the deeply strange and endlessly intriguing topic of past lives, but more specifically, cases where certain young children around the world have appeared to remember details of a previous life they led that are so bizarre that they've inspired decades worth of parapsychological research. This is going to be wild, so if you're ready, let's get started. Picture the scene. You're spending time with a young kid. Perhaps they're a family member or the child of a friend, someone you're close to but don't necessarily see every day. They're playing and chatting away like kids do, but all of a sudden they say something that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. They might casually mention their other family or old family, tell stories of an event that they couldn't possibly have any knowledge of, or speak of long-lost friends or relatives who died decades or even centuries earlier. You look to their parents and can tell by their reaction that they're not necessarily shocked, because these claims are something they've been hearing from their child for a little while now. It might sound like I'm describing the plot of some kind of supernatural movie, and I'm sure that over the years this kind of scenario has cropped up in numerous works of fiction. But what if I told you that today I'm not talking about fictional tales at all, but rather the kinds of real-life cases that have been extensively studied by researchers at the University of Virginia's School of Medicine since the 1960s. I told you this one was going to be strange, so get comfy because this wild ride is only just beginning. Allow me to introduce you to a man named Dr. Ian Stevenson, or technically reintroduce you to him, as long-time listeners may remember that I very briefly mentioned him in our episode about the Pollock sisters, which was installment 39 of the podcast. Now, Dr. Stevenson was the academic who founded the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies in 1967, having become fascinated by the accounts he had heard of children who seemed to remember a past life. In around 1960, when he took what he had learned so far and wrote a prize-winning essay on the topic for the American Society of Psychical Research. The more of these stories he heard, the more his interest grew, and Dr. Stevenson decided to create an environment in which these cases could be properly studied, with a balanced and level scientific approach, in order to try and understand what could possibly be behind them. And right off the bat in this episode, we have our first piece of interesting trivia, because one of the people who had read Dr. Stevenson's essay and become incredibly intrigued by the topic was Chester Carlson, a physicist and the inventor of electrophotography, who went on to become one of the founders of the company Xerox. He offered Dr. Stevenson a sum of cash to help fund further research into the cases of past life memories in children he had uncovered, and although this took some time to implement, Chester Carlson's donation became critical to the creation of Dr. Stevenson's research department. When he sadly passed away unexpectedly a short time later, it was revealed that Carlson had left $1 million to the department in his will, which just goes to show how strong his fascination really was. Now, I have so many fascinating facts to tell you about what the department has learned over the past almost 60 years, but now that I've given you a brief introduction to the researchers, I think it's time for the cases themselves to take center stage. So, let's take a closer look at some of the strangest and most compelling stories in which a child has appeared to recall details of a previous life. All of these tales are ones that have been studied at one time or another by the team at the University of Virginia, which was led most notably by Dr. Jim Tucker until just last year actually, following Dr. Stevenson's death in 2007. There are, of course, numerous other examples to be found the further you search, but I think knowing that these cases have been looked at by this unique academic department makes them extra fascinating. I believe that what these stories all have in common is that they leave you with this spine-tingling, unsettling, frankly uncanny feeling, and I think you'll see just what I mean. So let's begin with the case of a 4-year-old boy named Ryan from the US state of Oklahoma. For several months, Ryan had been saying things to his mum, Cindy, which she just couldn't make sense of. He would frequently ask her to take him to the house he'd lived in before, which he said was located in Hollywood, California. Ryan would describe the luxurious features of the house, which included things like a swimming pool. And I can imagine that Cindy initially put this down to her young son having an active imagination, maybe inspired by something he'd watched on TV or in a film. But when he woke up at 2 a.m. one morning, screaming and crying that he was homesick for the place, Cindy noticed that something seemed really wrong. She described trying to soothe Ryan back off to sleep, as she remarked that, quote, he was like a little old man who couldn't remember all the details of his life. He was so frustrated and sad. Wanting to try and comfort Ryan, Cindy proceeded to try and find some old library books about old Hollywood, complete with pictures, and when she brought them home, he was incredibly excited. He flicked through the books with immense enthusiasm until they reached a page which featured a still image from the 1932 film Night After Night. Ryan stopped in his tracks before shouting, "Mama, that guy's me. The old me." Now, Cindy and her husband found themselves at a bit of a crossroads. Although they didn't personally believe in the idea of reincarnation, they wanted to help their child. So Cindy went back to the library to see if there were any books on the concept of children seeming to remember a past life. And thanks to the University of Virginia team, there was. Dr. Jim Tucker was the author of the work Cindy had borrowed, and after spotting a note at the end of the book asking parents who had their own stories to share to get in touch with him, she did just that. After writing to Dr. Tucker to tell him about Ryan's claims, Cindy had also contacted an archivist who helped her to identify the actor her son had so strongly identified with in the photo. And before long, they had determined that he was actually a talent agent named Marty Martin, who had appeared in the film in an uncredited cameo role and had passed away on Christmas Day of 1964. What happened next is astonishing. Once Dr. Tucker heard about Ryan's case, he met with the mother and son and interviewed the 4-year-old about his memories of this alleged previous life. Cindy then arranged for a meeting to take place between herself, Ryan, Dr. Tucker, and Marty Martin's daughter. Having contacted her to explain the unusual situation she found herself in with her son. During this meeting, and with the help of certain public records, it was confirmed that over 50 different details that Ryan was able to recall about Marty's life were absolutely 100% correct. He was able to describe certain items items that had been in Marty's home, as well as the location of the property, and numerous other pieces of information about the late man's life and work that there was no way he could have known. Things like the fact he collected sunglasses, that he worked somewhere that changed people's names, i.e. the talent agency, and even which politicians of the day he had liked or disliked. Remember, Ryan was just 4 years old when he started articulating these memories, and many of the details that were corroborated were ones that Cindy had kept note of in a journal based on Ryan's recollections that he had spoken about before they ever even identified who Marty Martin was. To be fair, there were a few details that Ryan seemed to remember that weren't able to be verified, but it didn't take away from the extraordinary nature of the case. As Ryan grew up, he seemed to retain a keen interest in many of the things Marty had loved, including 1950s music, sunglasses, and New York City. But Cindy reported that as he got older, the intensity of his apparent connection with Marty started to lessen, and he was actively eager to be what he described as a regular kid. As I say, later on in the episode, we'll be having a look at what the researchers learned from cases like Ryan's. But for now, let's continue to dive into some of the other cases linked with the university. Back in 1975, Dr. Stevenson published the findings of research he had undertaken over the course of many years, after meeting with the family of a young girl in India named Kumkum Verma. 3.5-year-old Kumkum had lived in a small village all of her life, but one day she made a surprising announcement to her parents. She told them that she had once lived in the city of Darbhanga, around 25 miles away from where they resided, despite having never even visited there. But it wasn't just the name of the city Kumkum began speaking about. She was able to name the exact district she said she had lived in, and over time she revealed more and more information which built up this picture of a previous life she appeared to have led. Her aunt started noting down what Kumkum was saying, and although not all of these notes survived, by the time Dr. Stevenson heard about the little girl's story, he was able to see written accounts of around 18 of the details Kumkum remembered about her old life. She was able to describe so many specific things about this person she recalled being, including the fact she had been married to a blacksmith, the names of their son and grandson, the son's profession, the town her father had come from, owning a pet snake, and even things as particular as the fact that there had been a sword hanging up near to the bed she slept in as a child. Now, with all of this information at hand, Kumkum's father made the decision to contact a friend of his who lived and worked in Darbhanga to see if he could ask around and find out if anyone he knew recognized any of the information in these memories. Based on the details Kumkum had spoken about, which included the name Sundari, an employee of her father's friend was able to track down the son of the woman Kumkum believed she had once been. The son was able to verify that a large number of the facts the young girl appeared to remember did, in fact, match up with his mother's life. These things included the exact location of specific types of trees present on the road her house had stood on, the fact that there was a cinema very close to the house, that she had had to cross a river in order to visit her father's home, that her son had been a blacksmith too. The list goes on, but each verified detail meant the same thing, that Kumkum, even at 3-4 years old, somehow knew these true facts about a person who had died 5 years before she was even born. Then we have the story of a little boy from Glasgow named Cameron Macaulay. When Cameron was just 2 years old, he started to speak of a place he had never been to before, but felt an incredibly strong connection to, the remote Scottish island of Barra in the Outer Hebrides, over 200 miles away from where young Cameron lived with his mum, Norma, and his older brother. Like in the other 2 stories I've told you about, Cameron's recollections of his other life on Barra were both very specific and plentiful too. He would speak about watching his siblings play out of the window of the house he once lived in on the island, about how he had loved spending time there with a black and white dog, and even how his dad, who he said was named Shane Robertson, had tragically passed away after being hit by a car. As time went on, Cameron's longing for his previous life on Barra started to become particularly distressing for him, and I imagine for his mum too. He began to cry during his days spent at nursery, asking for his quote, Barra mum to come and pick him up instead of his Glasgow mum, saying that he missed his family on the island and wanted to go back to them. It must have been so upsetting for Norma to hear this, and while she had initially thought that her son was just making up stories, as the details became more particular and as his fixation on the place intensified, she couldn't ignore it any longer. After initially getting in touch with a child psychologist, but being disappointed in their suggestion that Cameron might have simply heard about the island from someone in passing and developed an unhealthy interest in it. As Norma knew this was definitely not the case, no one Cameron had interacted with had ever even been to Barra, she decided to get in touch with Dr. Jim Tucker. Now, what Dr. Tucker did next just goes to show how dedicated he is to his research and continuing the work that Dr. Stevenson started, because not only did he fly to Scotland from the US to meet with Cameron and Norma, but he then took the pair, along with Cameron's older brother, to Barra to see what they could uncover about the little boy's past life memories. The reason we know so much about what happened during this visit to Barra is because it was actually filmed. The documentary series Extraordinary People actually dedicated an episode entitled The Boy Who Lived Before to Cameron's story, and we see him arriving on the island as a slightly older child. He looked about 5 at this point, I would say, to try and see which of his memories could be verified. As soon as their small plane landed on Barra, which is home to just over 1,000 people, Cameron seemed to instantly recognize the place, saying, "I told you it was all true," and confirming that he felt happy to be back. As soon as Dr. Tucker and the family arrive on the island, they meet with a local historian who informs them that he doesn't recognize the name Robertson. And when Cameron fails to spot the white house he so vividly remembers living in as they drive around Barra, there's definitely an air of disappointment amongst the 2 adults. But soon they receive another phone call from the historian, and after taking a second meeting with him, some incredible information comes to light. There was, indeed, a Robertson family who had previously lived on the island during the 1960s or 70s, in a white house by the shore, just as Cameron had described. Without letting the little boy know that they were taking him to the property, so they didn't influence any part of his response to it, the group set off to see the house for themselves, and when they arrive, Cameron's reaction says it all. His usual bubbly, chatty demeanor is immediately replaced as they step out of their vehicle and take a look at the house up close. Cameron is quiet and tearful, and they realize that so many of the details of the home and surrounding land are just as he described back in Glasgow, right down to a hidden gate that links the property to the shore and the rocks below. Glasgow. It's quite eerie to watch. The group were then able to go inside the house, and although Cameron looked tentative at first, he was soon able to recall which bedrooms had belonged to his past life siblings. And in a heartbreaking moment, as they're all sat by the fireplace that the young boy appeared to remember well, he admitted that he missed his barren mom, though he had had no expectations that he was actually going to see her during the visit. Now, once their trip was over and they were back in Glasgow, Norma ended up meeting with a genealogist who had been asked to look into the Robertson family. Astonishingly, what was uncovered was that the Robertsons had initially come from Glasgow and had owned the house on the island for over 20 years. It was somewhere they would spend their summers, although the records didn't show that anyone named Shane Robertson had lived at the house. They were able to make contact with a woman named Jilly, who was part of the Robertson family. Cameron's response to the prospect of making contact with Jilly was something Norma described as strange. She said his moods were very changeable, but that he'd wondered out loud whether Jilly, who was now an older lady, could have been his sister. When the family did actually go and meet Jilly, one of the most amazing things that came out of the visit was that she revealed that their neighbours on the island had owned a black and white sheepdog, just as Cameron had described. She actually had photos of the dog in an album that she showed to Cameron and Norma, and although she confirmed that there hadn't been anyone in her family named Shane who had passed away in an accident, it was still incredible to add up how many of the other details did fit perfectly with Cameron's memories of his supposed prior life on Barra. Speaking about this balance, Norma made a good point when she highlighted that most of us would probably have varying degrees of accuracy when recalling our own childhoods. We'd get some things spot on and others would be more hazy. And considering that Cameron appeared to be remembering a whole other lifetime, we can perhaps forgive some of the inaccuracies when we note how many of the other facts were a total match. I could go on for hours telling you about countless other case studies, but the truth is that many of the stories follow the same format I've noted in these three examples. A child remembers numerous exact details from a life they say they previously led. Research is then done into their claims, with the conclusion being that many of the facts were perfectly corroborated, whereas others were either false or much less easy to verify. But the very existence of the correct detail matches, which almost always involve information the child could not have possibly known prior, is what makes these stories so utterly gripping. So I think it's time for us to loop back round to the matter of what the Division of Perceptual Studies have learned from the cases they've delved into over the decades. Now, of course, there is no way I can fit 60 years of research conclusions into this episode, but what I did want to do was highlight some of the key findings that I personally found incredibly compelling. Now, although the department also studies everything from near-death experiences to PSI or psychic phenomena, the topic of children who remember their past lives remains a key area of study for the researchers. And it's clear why. This subject couldn't be more interesting if it tried. What the academics have discovered is that most of the thousands of cases they've looked into involve children who began to have these memories that seem to be of a past life between the ages of around 2 and 5. When these apparent memories begin to show up, the child may also start to display certain behaviors, such as phobias, likes or dislikes that are, quote, unusual within the context of their particular particular family and cannot be explained by any current life events. Additionally, although this didn't happen in any of the 3 cases I shared with you earlier, one thing that sometimes shows up in the research is that the children in question can have birthmarks or even physical congenital conditions that actually match up with wounds or marks that their quote past life self also had. Dr. Stevenson actually published details of this in 1997 in a huge piece of work entitled Reincarnation and Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects. The work was made up of over 200 cases where he had identified this link, which he explored throughout 2,200 pages of writing. To make these connections, he referred to autopsy reports and medical records of the people he'd been able to identify as being the particular child's purported past self. One such case, as Dr. Tucker described, was of, quote, a girl who remembered the life of a man who underwent skull surgery and who had what Stevenson called the most extraordinary birthmark he had ever seen, a 3-centimeter wide area of pale scar-like tissue that extended around her entire head. A key reason why these birthmarks are seen as such a valuable part of the research is because they're physical. They don't just rely on the memories reported by the children. Honestly, the more you read about these particular cases, they are truly wild, to the point that they leave me a bit speechless. Of the thousands of cases contained within the department's databases, there's another bizarre trend. In around 70% of the examples, the person the child remembers being suffered an unnatural death in an accident, for example, and it's in 30% of these cases that the child will have a birthmark or other condition that links with that manner of death. That is unbelievably astonishing. Something I also thought was very interesting is that before a case is considered notable enough to add to the department's database, it's thoroughly investigated, with over 200 variables being considered for each individual situation. The team are very particular about the cases they even look into, and even more picky about which ones end up making it into the database. Something that Dr. Tucker mentioned in the documentary episode about Cameron McCauley that I thought was fascinating is that many of the children they've studied tend to start losing their previous life memories around the age of 6 or 7 as they start school and become more involved and wrapped up in the life they're currently living. So really, there's quite a small window in which these apparent recollections tend to surface, which only makes this entire topic more intriguing to me. And whilst all of this is highly thought-provoking, I can almost hear you all shouting the same question to me. It's the elephant in the room. So what? The researchers are saying that all of these children were reincarnated and did live a previous life. Well, no, not quite. Being academics, the researchers keep an open mind whilst conducting their work and believe that, quote, normal and paranormal explanations for the phenomenon warrant consideration. The normal explanation for these cases that the team believe is often most likely is that, quote, faulty memories by the children's families caused them to believe that their children knew more about a previous life than they actually did. Researchers have not investigated most of the cases until after the previous personality has been identified. Thus, the possibility exists that after children make a few general statements about having had a previous life, their parents find another family that has lost a family member. And once the two families exchange information, they come to think that the children demonstrated specific knowledge about the previous life beforehand, that they in fact did not. But as for the possible paranormal explanations, well, that's all much less straightforward. I'm sure some of you will have noticed that although I've spoken about stories from different parts of the world, I've not made any mention of religion. There is a good reason for this, and it's largely to do with me wanting to remain respectful of different beliefs around the idea of reincarnation. The researchers also try to keep these boundaries in place and tend to use terms like carryover rather than reincarnation, because the latter phrase is so closely linked with certain religions. Dr. Tucker also points out that while some of the cases they've looked into have occurred in places with a prevalent cultural or religious belief around reincarnation, others haven't, which I think is noteworthy in itself. But to be clear, whatever terminology is used, the researchers aren't claiming to have made any definitive conclusions when it comes to the paranormal side of things. Could it be that memories or experiences or even traumas from one person's life could, in certain uncommon cases, carry over to a new life? That's something the academics seem very keen on exploring further. There is research that suggests that things like traumatic experiences can imprint on our RNA, the biological molecule, and could potentially be passed down through generations. So could some paranormal, non-genetic version of this be at play within these rare cases? The simple answer is that we just don't know. Many of those involved with the research speak about the unexplainable things they have encountered during their work, but there haven't been any definitive statements made about exactly what the explanations in these cases could be. Inspired by Dr. Stevenson's methodical, careful approach, the Division of Perceptual Studies seem dedicated to continuing their research into various areas linked with the idea of consciousness, including this one. And although their work is considered controversial by some, skeptics and believers alike, there is no doubt that it's endlessly mesmerizing to hear about. Well, considering that this subject is still so much a matter of belief, I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on this one. What's your immediate reaction to these stories? Do you land firmly on the skeptical side and think that there's always a rational explanation behind each individual case? Or are you more of a believer and feel that it's entirely possible that these young people really did hold some memories of a past life during their early years? Have you got any experience with this kind of thing, either yourself or via someone you know? I am so looking forward to reading your comments and hearing your thoughts. But for the time being, we still have one quick section left to go in this episode. So join me as we scoot on over to our trusty outro feature, Weird Media. If you're into your horror films or like to keep up with new movie releases in general, I'm sure you'll already be familiar with the film I'm about to recommend to you in Weird Media today. It has been the talk of the genre's particular corner of the internet for a few months now, and a couple of weeks ago I decided it was time to check it out. And oh my god, it was fantastic. I'm talking about the movie Obsession that was written and directed by Curry Barker. Now, I am the first person to hold my hands up and admit that I'm a bit of a horror film snob. It's always the genre that I have the strongest opinions about. If I love a horror, I will defend it until the end of time. But if something about it just doesn't click for me, I will literally never think or talk about it ever again, like it never existed. I know that's weird, but I have always been the same. Anyway, I went into Obsession with pretty high expectations, just because there'd been so much buzz about it, and I was absolutely not disappointed. In fact, it was even better than I'd anticipated, and I think I've worked out why. It's because it took a very simple premise and executed it to perfection in my eyes. The plot is quite straightforward. A young man is in a spooky shop and spots a vintage-looking novelty item called a one-wish willow. The idea is that you make a wish, break the stick in half, and it comes true. So the guy, Baron, makes a wish that his friend Nikki, who he has a crush on, would love him more than anyone else in the world. And the story goes from there with terrifying consequences. I know that when I describe it like that, it sounds cheesy, but I promise that it is the real deal. It has excellent performances from the entire cast. The pace of the film is perfect for the level of tension, and it has the ideal balance of scares and storyline. I thought it was brilliant. There were a couple of moments where I guessed what was about to happen, but the twists and turns were always so well done that I didn't even mind. So if you're in the mood to watch a good horror, I honestly think Obsession is a great film to pop on your list. Thank you all so much for joining me today. In the description box or show notes, I'll be including links and shout outs to all of the sources I used during the course of my research. And I'll also be listing our social media pages along with our email address. If you're listening on Spotify, please do leave us a comment and share your thoughts on this topic. You can also get in touch on Instagram, TikTok, Threads, or Facebook too. If you've enjoyed this episode, I would massively appreciate a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's an amazing free way to show your support for the show. Finally, if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thanks so much again for being here today, and I'll be back next week with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others, and keep it weird, for the good kind of weird.